about a piece, to learn more about a piece from our permanent collection. And before we get into everything, I want to say that I think Masterpieces at Midday, the strength in the programming lies in not only the fact that as an institution, we get to share more about our permanent collection with visitors and viewers. It's also an opportunity for staff members like myself to spend time with pieces from our permanent collection and really start to cultivate a stronger understanding of our history as an institution, our collecting practices, what we've done in the past, and how that's kind of informing informing our practice as we move forward. So I'm gonna flip how things usually work because I'm also part of the education department. So we're gonna do a visual analysis, and I'm gonna start by saying that the other track of my life of teaching art history courses, a common thing I hear in any context, whether it's museum education with like third graders or undergraduate students, is from a very early age, we're taught that we're either creative and we can think in that creative way with that creative brain, or we're not. And so I've had conversations with, 7-year-olds who are, yes, I'm an artist, I'm creative, whereas their friends have been like, no, I'm not creative. And I say, why? And they're like, well, someone told me, or I can't draw. And so as an educator in an institutional setting, in a museum setting, it's really important for me to give people tools and communicate things and tactics I've learned throughout my career on how to make people feel more comfortable looking at a visual piece of work, right? And so there's a term called visual literacy. And again, because of society or whatever, we're scripted at a very early age to think we're creative or not. But I want to give everyone a little secret and a little disclaimer again today. Everybody has some form of visual literacy. So we exist in a world, right, where we're consuming images on the daily. And so you have fine art, high art, or whatever, how you want to frame it in the museum sector, but on the daily, right? Instagram, when you're driving, looking at billboards, you have experience looking at these visual symbols and decoding them in a way. It's just so ingrained in who we are as a culture and community that people think they don't have that skill, but I'm here to tell you, you do have that skill. So the piece we're looking at right now is the piece we're going to end with, and it's by Sandra Ramos, and we're doing a bit of a Quentin Tarantino moment. We're starting with what we're going to end with, and I'm going to walk you guys through how to do a visual analysis. So if you want to go through this with a piece of paper and a pencil, or if you want to write it down on your phone or just think responses to these steps I'm sharing, please do so. So our end goal is to talk about what this piece is about, right? Decode it. What does it mean? What is the artist trying to communicate? So step one in a visual analysis is to observe and state the formal elements of a piece of artwork. And this is another tip for everybody. This is what art historians, researchers, this is how we approach visual content. If we're especially unfamiliar with a piece, we'll start by doing a visual or formal analysis. So you state the colors you see, the shapes you see, the amount of things you see. So for example, in this piece, you could list how many goldfish you see. You talk about the style of the piece. So for example, does this look more like a photograph? Is it realistic, or is it more abstract? And that starts to put you in the mindset of how to decode the visual thing you're looking at. It is very important, and this is a part I'm not good at because I like to jump into the symbolism immediately. When you're doing this process, you start by just stating formal elements. So it's very dry. It's listing things you see. Then you stop with that step and let that kind of ruminate for a minute. The next step I'll do in my classroom. So step one really is, if we're going to get down to the nitty gritty, step one, observe, state formal elements, is a visual analysis. Another exercise I have used that I feel is helpful, and you may want to use it next time you're at a museum or looking at something, is describe the composition of the piece in detail. So this is an activity you can do with your friends when you're in a museum, to kind of just heighten your experience and really hone in on your visual thinking strategies. So describe the composition of the piece in detail. When you're doing this, I would suggest you approach it in a way that, say you're with a friend and you have access, you're able to see this piece. So the piece we're looking at right now, you can see it, but your friend can't. And you are having to describe the piece to them in such detail that if they were to draw it, it would look very similar to the piece you're looking at. That's the amount of detail you need in order to, again, spend more time with this piece and be able to start to unpack it. Then you get into what I think is the exciting part. It kind of ties the work into the context of its space and time in which it was created. So you start to consider what's these elements. So what could the goldfish symbolize? What could this blue rectangle symbolize? What could this hand symbolize? And you look at those elements independently, discreetly, and together. And so this is a really good place to start when you're trying to approach any kind of artwork in any context. It starts the process of having you think about, especially step 3, when you consider symbols discreetly and together. That's when you're going to start to recognize your own lived experiences. And so what I mean by that is a goldfish could represent something completely different for me than it could for Andrea, right? But that's important to know when you're an art historian or researching art, that, okay, so my immediate thought, given my life lens, is that this goldfish symbolizes abundance. You have that as a starting off point, as a platform for when you go into the 4th steps, which I haven't shared here. The 4th step of this process would be conducting research and getting context, which is what I'm going to give you in the presentation. But in step 4, you can keep going back to these markers or this foundation you've created through these previous 3 steps. So that's just my little education thing. We'll get it out of the way. I hope it's a helpful tool for people to use. If you have any questions about this in the future, feel free to reach out to me. It's something I would love to do. If you visit the museum, feel free to come in. We can talk through this together and we can see other pieces at the museum. Okay, historical context. So now we're in step 4, right? We're doing our research. We're trying to figure out more about this piece we just saw by Sandra Ramos. So we start in Cuba. What is Cuba? Cuba is an island. It also is comprised of some archipelagos and this island right here. It is south of the United States. You can see Florida, right? You can see the very tip of Florida. And so you can see that they're very close. Cuba's very close to the United States. This is an image of their flag. And in terms of historical context, Cuba is known for its sugar trade. It was colonized by Western Europeans. So there's that history of colonization, enslaved peoples. All of that has kind of ruminated together to create the culture, the visual culture, the artistic culture, the musical culture of Cuba. And then in terms of the relationship between the United States and Cuba, I'm sharing this because it's important to Sandra and the work she does. And so we're starting with around the end of the Cuban Revolution. And so in 1958, that's not on this timeline, but in 1958, the United States imposed an embargo on, we wouldn't trade arms or any kind of military weapons with Cuba because there was a revolution going on, and the United States actually backed the previous ruler, or the previous dictator, Batista. He was backed by the United States. And in 1959, Fidel Castro leads this revolution, overthrows Batista. And this is when we start to kind of see this fraying of this relationship between the United States and Cuba, because the United States, we were very much seated in our democratic nature, our free market capitalism. We also had a really big share in the sugar trade and the sugar, the sugar that was being produced in Cuba. The United States actually owned a lot of the businesses that was creating that trade. And so when Castro came into power, we lost that. And so from an economic standpoint, the United States wasn't happy. In 1960, Cuba decided to nationalize US-owned businesses on the island. And so there was a series of issues and acts between Cuba and the United States that kind of just adds to this narrative of contention or contentious partnership or contentious relationship with Cuba. So May 1960, Cuba started buying weapons from the Soviet Union because the US had placed the embargo in 1958. And so they're like, okay, well, we're gonna buy from the USSR. And so the US, to counter that and to show that we were displeased with that decision, in July of 1960, we reduced our imports of sugar from Cuba. And so Cuba then turned again to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union started importing that sugar that the US would have imported. So they're strengthening their bonds, their ties. And then in October 1960, the US refused to export oil to Cuba. So once more, Cuba turns to the USSR and is like, hey, we need oil. The USSR could only produce unrefined oil. So what Cuba did is they nationalized the oil refineries on the island that were owned by US businesses. So that means they were no longer US businesses. They kind of just absorbed them and said, this is ours now. And so again, we're just building and building this contentious relationship is forming. So then in 1961, the US breaks off diplomatic relations with Cuba, and we have the Bay of Pigs invasion that fails. And that was a group of Cuban exiles backed by the United States that were trying to get on the island to overthrow Castro. It didn't happen. 1962, the US imposes trade restrictions on Cuba. Soviet missiles in Cuba bring the world to the brink of war. So again, just all this tension is building. 1977, Washington and Havana open special interest sections. 1980, 125,000 Cubans go to exile in the United States. So we see a large Cuban population emerge in Miami because of the geographic proximity to the island. And 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. And so in this moment, Cuba goes into something called the special period, and I'm going to discuss that on the next slide, but just keep in mind 1991 becomes a pivotal part, especially for Sandra, because she starts producing work, or she's said that she started entering the art sector in 1993 is the date she gives. So 1991 is a pivotal moment for our discussion today. General other history, 2001, the US enforces the trade embargo with Cuba. 2006, Fidel hands over power to his brother Raul. This is him in the slide. 2014, US and Cuba agree to renew diplomatic ties. 2015, Obama and Raul Castro meet to restore diplomatic relations. 2016, Obama visits Cuba, and he's the first US president to do this since 1928. And so at that point, the embassy is starting to open again. We, as in citizens of the United States, we can visit Cuba to do like philanthropic work, missions, religious missions, things like that. We can get a special visa to be in Cuba. And then in 2017, Trump's administration enacts new rules which reinforce the business and travel restrictions loosened by Obama's administration. So we're not there yet, but we're starting to build this better, stronger connection. So to go into detail about the special period, and this is the period in time where Sandra was creating work and creating her visual repertoire. So this lasted from 1991 to 2000, and it's a direct result of the end of the Soviet Union. It's specifically a time of economic hardship for Cuba. You're seeing extreme rationing of food by the government, utilities. Sometimes there are 20-hour blackouts a day. Cars are being discouraged as a mode of transportation. The government actually disperses a bunch of bicycles for people to use. People start using horse-drawn carriages to get around, and access to healthcare is not great. One of the things I read while I was conducting this research that was pretty interesting, and I haven't done enough research to have a solid opinion on it, but from a medical perspective, there was a big decrease in heart disease, diabetes, some of these chronic illnesses. So some people cite that, well, yeah, it wasn't great in terms of, I was riding my bike everywhere, but I got very healthy. Other people shared that, malnutrition was a huge issue. So take that with a grain of salt. I just thought it was an interesting fact to share. And then in 2000, the hardship began to ease when Cuba began to trade medical services for petroleum with Venezuela. And around the same time, there's this economic reform. So the Cuban government has no choice at this point but to start to rejoin the international trade network. And so they amend their constitution. They allow new forms of private and corporate property ownership. They regulate foreign investment, and they decriminalize the circulation of the US dollar. The other thing they do, they started to try and up their tourism from external parties. And so they renovated airports, they renovated hotels, they tried to make it this, come step back in time moment for people to come. I don't know if anyone else is a Kardashian fan, but I know they went to Cuba. So it worked for some individuals. And then another endearing component of this period of time, so 1991 to 2000, is it wasn't just an economic hardship that Cubans were facing. It was but there was also this idea of a crisis of identity, a crisis of politics, ideologies, values, and faith that, we may not be able to move forward. We're kind of stuck in this rut. So a phrase came about that was used a lot, and it's inventar y resolver, which means invent and resolve. And it became a motto for many. So a lot of people use this as a way to center themselves, as a way to feel faithful or hopeful in the future, that if we're innovative, if we're resilient, we will invent new ways, we are going to come to a solution, and we're going to move forward. So that's just a very general background of some Cuban history that is pertinent to Sandra and the ASU Art Museum and our relationship with Cuban art. And so in 1998, the ASU Art Museum, we presented an exhibition called Contemporary Art from Cuba, Irony and Survival on the Utopian Island. And this exhibition had 17 artists, and it represented a milestone for Cuban art in the United States. And this was actually the first time that Sandra came to the United States. It was part of this exhibition. So in 1998, if you listen to interviews by her, she talks about her first visit to the States was in 98, and that was because of us. And so, being a part of this museum team now, it's really exciting to hear that because she's become such a prominent figure. So it's just a little, feather in our cap that this exhibition was a foundational point in her career in terms of her international recognition. And so the exhibition actually traveled nationally and started to establish the museum's collection in contemporary Cuban art. This is another set of images. And in this exhibition, there is a reflection of a bunch of different realities that occurred in Cuba, specifically during the special period, 91 to 2000, and the impact of the US embargo on trade relationship between the United States and Cuba. Some of the artists talked about Cuba's complex, history, with it being a colonized community, its love-hate relationship with the United States, and its combination of African, European, and Asian cultures. We also see this use of humor as a coping mechanism for these struggles and the challenges of everyday life that were present during this special period. And then this is a piece, one of the mechanisms or ways people would try to leave Cuba is by making makeshift boats. So in this piece, we see an artist has created a makeshift boat on a sea of beer bottles. And a lot of people, these boats were called Balseros, and a lot of people actually lost their lives trying to make that journey from Cuba to Florida in these makeshift boats. So, and we're finally to Sandra. So I was very excited when Andrea asked me to give this talk, because when I first started at the museum, one of the first exhibitions that was up was Watertight, and it was a solo exhibition of works by Sandra. And I just remember giving tours to anyone from third graders again to university students to public community members who came in who were of an older age demographic, and everybody could find a point of access with her work. And her works are very political. She uses humor, but because they're so stimulating visually, kids loved them. They loved the narrative format of her videos. They loved the repetition of characters she uses in her work. Adults loved sharing information about what the relationship between the US and Cuba was like when they were younger. And so I think her work, because she uses a specific cast of characters, and she does this repetition of, she'll use water in her work a lot. We'll talk about that a little bit more. We saw it in the piece I shared earlier, but she's really created this kind of visual lexicon of images that is repeated and allows people to access what she's creating and feel connected, not just to one work, but kind of work through an exhibition space as a narrative, as a journey. So I think that's a great strength of hers. Let's see. This is her Instagram. If anyone wants to follow her on Instagram, it's Sandra Ramos Art. Okay, so she was born in 1969. She is a painter, printmaker, collagist, installation artist, and she explores ideas of nationality, gender, identity in her work. She started to gain this reputation of how she expresses her personal relationship to the politics and history of Cuba by using these characters. And so I'm going to break down her most prominent character in a couple slides, but she becomes known for creating these characters to comment on the struggles and hardships, not just in the past, but she's doing a lot of work now presently about Trump. So she's created a new Trump character. And so she's committed to a style, and we've been able to see this progression of style throughout her work. She currently lives and works in Miami, and she is known, one of the fun facts in researching her, she's known for having graduated from some very prestigious institutions in Cuba. So I think she has a strong fan base in Cuba and the United States as well. And then this quote I thought really summed up her kind of approach to her work. And she says, "All my work tells different stories related to Cuba, but anyone can connect. At the end, it's about a human concern." So this is her most prominent character. I think I'm hoping it's on the left for you. It's on the left for me. But we see this image of Alice from Alice in Wonderland. And this is the character that Sandra created. And she calls her the Little Pioneer. And the Little Pioneer is comprised of this original sketch of Alice in Wonderland and kind of a self-portrait from Sandra. And this character will go through different scenarios. Sandra will create these situations for this little girl, the Little Pioneer, to work through. And they're meant to satirize kind of the absurdity of her government, of politics in Cuba, of just the lived experience in what it is or what it was to be in Cuba from 91 to 2000. All right, so this is the exhibition Watertight that I was talking about, and it was a series of 8 short videos, and there were some books that she made, some 3-dimensional books she made, and it explored the complex historic relationships between Cuba and the US, and her figures go again through these different scenarios to kind of try and problem solve something, but it's like a fruitless venture. There's a race was one of the videos, and people are stumbling, and so she really does use humor as a way. Again, these 3rd graders loved the humor, and it was a great entry point to have this conversation about what is satire, how can you use humor to make a commentary on something that's a little less humorous, a little more serious. All right, and I have, hopefully this will work. I'm going to play it. If you can't hear the audio, please let me know. I'm going to play a clip from Aquarium, which was part of this exhibition, Watertight. All right, so I'm gonna break this up a little bit for everybody. So in this video, I think this highlights some of the things we've already talked about today. This idea of inventar y resolver at the very end specifically. But you'll see, like I talked about earlier, is she uses water a lot. And so water has to do with this idea of needing to be fluid in your life, but also this sense of isolation and the fact that she's from an island community. So this idea of isolation in terms of literally being surrounded by water, this economic isolation in terms of the special period from 91 to 2000 is you're very much isolated, and feelings of how do you deal with that? How do you cope with that? How do you form an identity? How do you form a sense of visual structure in terms of being a creative and an artist? And so we then see her character, right, that is a representation of herself and this girl, Alice in Wonderland, who, if you know that history, have that context, goes on this fantastical adventure, right? And so we're having that connection between this idea of being disconnected, being in this fantastical world, maybe not in such a positive sense and in a more negative sense. But you see this little girl, and her body actually becomes the shape of Cuba. And so this is harkens to the idea that Sandra talks about, building a country off of your back, the backs of the people, that things are established by the everyday man. It's not necessarily our elected officials, right, that are producing these changes, or it's not these elected officials who are suffering the most hardship in these times because of decisions. It's the everyday human. And so we start to see the palm trees emerge, which is another theme you see in a lot of her works, and that's just to symbolize Cuba as a tropical island. We see this girl is in an aquarium, and so you can talk about, again, ideas of confinement, being stuck, being isolated. You see the static on the TV, again, kind of connects to this idea of disconnection. You're getting that static because you're not connected to whatever's on the receiving end of this antenna. And at one point, I'm not sure if you can see this, but those microphones come out and grab the little girl. And so for me, right, if we're going back to these steps we talked about at the very beginning of this talk, that to me connects to 2020 in the sense of, like, I can feel consumed, and I've talked to friends who feel all consumed by media, especially around times of the election that's happening, so that visual representation, I connect to that. And it may not be what Sandra was trying to convey when she created this piece, but it does highlight the fact that her works are transferable in terms of time and space, and these themes can be applicable outside of this box of her as a Cuban artist, right? So that visual is applicable to 2020. And then at the very end, the last thing that strikes me is we see this kind of swell, and it may be difficult to tell, but these are supposed to represent a bunch of individual people. And so it's this idea of, with a large crowd, with a collective thought, that you can rupture or deconstruct this box that you're in, either literally or hypothetically. And it's also interesting to think about, after my research, this visual also connected to this idea of the petroleum trade and this reliance on the USSR, and how when they collapsed, Cuba's economy essentially collapsed for a bit as well. All right, so we get to art and focus, highlighting women artists in our collection. And so for those of you who have not visited the museum, I expect to see you at the museum after this presentation, but we have a space at the main museum. It's called Art and Focus, and it's a gallery that allows us to highlight pieces from our permanent collection. And our most recent iteration is called Highlighting Women Artists in the Collection. And Brittany Corrales and Mary Beth Biskin, the two curators who worked on this, did a very thoughtful job in selecting 27 pieces. We have 9 are 2D and 18 are 3D by women from the permanent collection. And, 2020 has been rough, right? But it's been an opportunity for us as a cultural institution to really highlight and rethink how we're showing different artists in our collection. And we really wanted to highlight women because historically, artists represented in the US in museums are white and they're male. So I'll read this little blue box. So historically, artists represented in art museums in the United States have been overwhelmingly male and white. In fact, a 2019 study analyzed the race and gender of the artists in the collections of 18 major art museums and found that 3/4 of them are white men. Women represent only 12.6% of this group, 9% are Asian, 2.8% are Hispanic or Latinx, 1.2% are Black or African American, and 1.5% are classified as other ethnicities. And while we recognize that the system is not perfect, this is a concrete step in us wanting to communicate that we are here to support women, we are here to support BIPOC artists. And so it's a very powerful exhibition. I really encourage all of you to come see it for yourselves and use the strategies we talked about at the beginning of this presentation to try and dive in more to the visual images you're seeing. So we come back to our first image, and it's by Sandra Ramos. It's untitled, and it's a lithograph. And to be completely honest, I reached out to her. I tried to do research, and there's not much about what her intent was with this piece. But I think after looking at all the other work she's done, reviewing different exhibitions she's had, and seeing her interviews, reading her interviews, what I take away from this piece is her use of symbolism as something that with the hope that people can access her work easily. So before I open it up to questions, I was hoping if anyone did work through the steps, they would like to share what they think this piece is about, and we can kind of have a quick conversation. Anybody?
Kat, I'll share.
Thank you.
I see this, and I'm just imagine this is a painting, right? Lithograph. Okay.
A lithograph. It's a print. Yeah.
It reminds me of the video you just showed us in many ways, except in so the fortress being the island surrounded. It's the aquarium, the island, the fortress being Cuba, represented in the hands of one individual controlling it, and it's secluded and contained, and also beautiful and disturbing.
Right. Thank you. Sid, did you have any thoughts? Let me see if I can unmute you. Hold on. Or Andrea, can you unmute Sid? Let's see. That work? Sid, you're unmuted if you'd like to try and share.
Did you ever speak with Sandra?
Huh?
Did you ever speak with Sandra?
Not yet. She hasn't responded.
Did you ever speak with Marilyn Zeitlin?
I did not, no.
Why not?
I didn't think to reach out to her. I just reached out to Sandra.
Well, we met her 20 years ago, and Marilyn is the source of all knowledge at ASU Art Museum.
All right. Well, I will look into that, and we can add more to Sandra and TMS. Thank you.
Kat, can I add something?
I would love that. Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to point out that this print is interesting because we actually notice that it says stage 11 in the title. We actually have 11 prints by Sandra Ramos that lead up to this print, and each one is an individual print in our collection. So it shows the process of the layering of the colors and the imagery to get to the final print. Which is really cool because we have the opportunity to show the entire process of how she arrived at the final image with this final lithograph.
That is really cool. Okay, so before we go to questions, I just wanted to end with this quote from Sandra, and she says, "For me, making art is a way of communication with all human beings and with the future." And so I will leave you guys with that and open it up to questions.
Catherine, I thought it was great. Going back to your initial opening on visual literacy, how do we, or how does the museum field address issues of visual literacy for non-sighted or seeing impaired individuals?
That's a really good question. And to be frank, we do not do a good job.
Okay.
So that's an area that definitely needs to be developed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Michael, to answer your question, also, we do occasional programs for if we have someone who's seeing impaired. We have more options with our ceramics collection, where we do have more of a teaching piece. We, as Catherine mentioned, we don't do enough. We have made special accommodations before for people to fill pieces. It's just really hard with 2D works, especially with the delicate surfaces and the nature of them. We've had at different times, we've even had ceramic artists who've had like a solo exhibition. We've asked for pieces that people, not only visually impaired, but anyone can touch a few times. And sometimes we can make that happen and sometimes we can't. It is something, running a program for the visually impaired is a whole program. And in order to do it right, it takes a lot of resources and a lot of a collection specifically that allows for that interaction that we don't currently have.
I noticed that last week, the University of Arizona's Museum of Art had a post on their social media about a graduate student intern who is working on that very thing. She is working on doing image descriptions for every image that they release on their social media feeds. So it's a very short 2-sentence description that just goes underneath the caption for those who are unable to actually view the images. So that, I think that's something that we can incorporate in the future.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, if there aren't any other questions, I will be here on Thursday hostessing the next masterpiece at Midday, but thank you everybody for tuning in, and I hope to see you guys Thursday.